Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going deep on a topic that's been in the news a lot lately, and stirring up a lot of conversation, frankly. The world of incels.
Yeah, it's one of those things that can feel very online, but as we'll see, it has some very real-world consequences that we need to try to understand.
For sure. And to help us do that, we've got some fascinating articles here from the BBC and Euronews, and even some pretty powerful images that are circulating in these incel forums.
Yeah, those can be pretty disturbing.
Definitely. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, we're going to be using that definition straight from the Cambridge Dictionary, which defines incel,
Right, short for all.
short for involuntary celibate. So by the end of this deep dive, we want you to walk away really understanding who incels are, what's driving their ideology, and why it matters to the rest of us.
A good place to start, I think, is with the human side of all of this.
Right.
The BBC article does a really good job of this by profiling a guy named Jack Peterson, who actually identifies as an incel and has even spoken to major media outlets. His story really helps us see past the label, and understand the personal struggles that can lead someone down this path.
Yeah, his story was pretty powerful.
Yeah.
He talked about feeling like a failure and dealing with constant rejection and just this deep sense of isolation.
Mm-hmm.
He finally found these incel forums online, and for the first time, he felt like he'd found people who understood him.
It's that search for belonging that makes these online spaces so alluring, but unfortunately, it's also where they encounter the black pill,
Right, the black pill.
which is this really pessimistic ideology that's basically become the foundation of incel belief.
Okay, so let's break that down a bit. What exactly is this black pill idea? I mean, what makes it different from just feeling down about dating?
Well, the black pill goes way beyond typical dating frustrations.
Okay.
It tells these men that attraction is purely determined by your genes.
Oh, wow.
So it's this really fatalistic worldview where if you're not born with the right looks, you're basically destined to a life without love or intimacy.
Wow, that's bleak.
It's extremely bleak, and it just breeds resentment towards anyone they see as having won the genetic lottery.
It's like setting yourself up for failure almost. If you believe you're doomed from the start, why even bother trying?
Exactly, and to make matters worse, they have these almost cartoonish representations of what they see as the ideal man and woman.
Right.
The BBC article calls them Chads and Stacys.
Yeah, I've seen those memes floating around online. It's like that hyper-masculine, successful guy who gets all the girls versus the beautiful, unattainable woman who only dates those chads.
Exactly. It's this really dangerous oversimplification that dehumanizes entire groups of people and just fuels that cycle of anger and blame.
The really scary thing is it's not just contained to these online forums. This anger actually spills over into the real world.
Oh, absolutely.
The Euronews article cites this really chilling statistic. It says nearly 1,000 misogynistic or violent statements are shared every single day on these incel forums.
Wow.
And that number has increased eightfold since 2016.
That's a huge jump.
It's a pretty clear indication that this ideology is growing in intensity.
Yeah, and it really blurs the lines between what's said online and what happens in real life.
Right.
And while it's important to remember that not all incels are violent, that constant exposure to this hateful content, it can really desensitize people and in some cases even incite them to action.
And we've tragically seen this play out in horrifying ways. The 2014 Isla Vista killings by Elliot Rodger, who openly identified as an incel, are a stark reminder of just how dangerous this ideology can be.
Right, he murdered 6 people and then himself, all fueled by this deep-seated hatred of women.
It's terrifying, and he's actually become a disturbing icon in certain corners of the incel community.
It's really disturbing and further cements that link between incel ideology and violence in a lot of people's minds.
And it's a grim reminder that this isn't just an online thing.
No, not all.
And it's not just a North American problem either.
Right.
Euronews highlights a recent case in Istanbul involving a man named Semih Shelik, whose actions and the imagery he used were associated with incels. And it's raising some serious concerns about how far this movement is spreading globally.
So where do we go from here? I think it's really crucial to understand the psychology behind all of this. Research suggests that a lot of incels struggle with depression, anxiety, and just really profound social isolation.
Right. It's easy to just label them as hateful misogynists. But like you said, there's this whole deeper layer of pain and isolation there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
These are human beings who are hurting and looking for connection, but sadly, they're finding it in all the wrong places.
So it's not enough to just address those misogynistic views head on.
Right.
We have to look at the underlying pain and trauma that might be driving them in the first place.
Exactly. And that's where empathy becomes so important. You know, the Euronews article quotes a woman named Emily who spent years observing the incel community in Toronto, and she really emphasizes the need to project love and positivity into the world rather than letting ourselves get sucked into all that hatred and resentment.
I love that message. It's such a good reminder that there's always hope, even in the darkest corners of the internet.
Exactly. And that's something we're going to explore further as we continue our deep dive.
Awesome. We'll be right back after a quick break with part 2.
You know, picking up on that idea that change is possible within these communities, it really makes you wonder what leads someone to that kind of ideology in the first place.
That's a good point. It's easy to just condemn the whole thing.
Yeah.
But if we want to actually address the problem, we need to try and understand those root causes. What are some of the factors that contribute to someone adopting this kind of worldview?
Well, one factor that we can't really ignore is the role of the internet itself.
Right.
For a lot of young men who are already feeling isolated and disconnected, the online world can actually make those feelings even worse.
Wow. Yeah, the BBC article talked about how these incel forums can become echo chambers, where those extreme views are just constantly being reinforced.
Exactly. And the algorithms that a lot of these platforms use can actually make things even worse.
How so?
Well, they end up pushing users towards more and more extreme content, so it creates this kind of feedback loop of negativity.
It's like falling down a rabbit hole, you know?
Yeah.
You might start out just looking for some advice on dating, but then you're suddenly bombarded with all these messages blaming women for everything wrong with society.
Right. And it's really important to remember that this incel community, it's not like a monolithic thing,
Yeah.
There are actually different levels of engagement and belief.
Okay.
The Euronews article even mentions this term fake cells,
Fake cells.
which refers to people who might identify as incels, but actually are able to have relationships with women.
I'm guessing that doesn't go over very well in those online forums.
Not at all. They're often ridiculed and ostracized, which just reinforces this idea that if you don't completely buy into the ideology, you're either a traitor or a liar.
So it becomes less about actually finding a girlfriend and more about conforming to this very specific and, frankly, pretty harmful worldview.
Exactly. And that's where we see the influence of the manosphere.
Right.
The Euronews article describes it as this broader network of online communities and influencers who promote a very specific and often toxic view of masculinity.
So we're talking about groups like men's rights activists, pickup artists, even figures like Andrew Tate, who's kind of become infamous for his misogynistic views.
Right.
What's the connection between these groups and incels?
There's definitely a lot of overlap. Incels are often drawn to these messages about male victimhood and female manipulation.
Okay.
It feeds into their existing resentment and reinforces that us versus them mentality.
It's like a breeding ground for negativity and really distorted perceptions of gender roles.
Yeah, and that's where the question of intervention becomes so important.
Right. How do we actually reach these individuals and offer them a different path, a way out of that echo chamber?
It's a tough question. Euronews pointed out that just shutting down these online forums might not be the answer.
Right. They'll probably just pop up somewhere else.
Exactly. And censorship can sometimes backfire and make these groups feel even more persecuted and push them farther underground.
So what are the alternatives? How do we disrupt this cycle of negativity and hopefully prevent more violence?
Well, some experts believe that focusing on mental health support is a really key part of this.
Okay.
The Euronews article talks about this program in Canada called ETA that's specifically designed to provide counseling and support to young incels.
Interesting. What have they learned from working with these guys?
Well, early findings suggest that a lot of these young men have experienced things like trauma and neglect or intense social isolation in their lives, which can really contribute to those feelings of alienation and anger.
So it's not just about addressing the misogynistic views themselves, it's about dealing with the underlying pain and trauma that might be causing them.
Exactly. And that's where empathy is so crucial. Emily, the woman we talked about earlier, who's been studying the incel community, she really stresses the importance of projecting love and positivity, even towards people who might seem hateful.
It's about seeing them as human beings who are hurting, not just as monsters.
Right.
It sounds idealistic,
Yeah.
but I do think there's real power in that compassionate approach.
Absolutely. Offering compassion and understanding can be a really powerful first step in breaking down those walls of anger and resentment.
So maybe the key is to move away from labeling and condemning and instead try to focus on listening and understanding.
I think so.
But what about the very real threat of violence? How do we address that? We'll dive into that really complicated question and explore the debate surrounding whether or not incel violence should be classified as terrorism, when we come back for part 3 of our deep dive. So we've been talking about how complex this incel world is, the anger, the isolation, and the potential for violence. And that leads us to a really tough question: should incel violence actually be classified as terrorism?
Yeah, it's a debate that's been going on for years, and it really gets to the heart of how we understand and address this whole phenomenon.
Right.
Part of the challenge is that there's no single universally agreed upon definition of terrorism.
Right.
Different countries and organizations all have their own criteria, and there's often a big emphasis on political or ideological motivation.
Yeah, the Euronews article really highlighted that point.
Right.
Even experienced investigators and legal experts have trouble drawing that line between, acts of violence that are purely personal and those that are driven by some broader ideology.
And that's what makes the incel phenomenon so complicated,
Yeah.
because on the one hand, you have this very clearly defined ideology, rooted in misogyny and this belief that men are entitled to sex and relationships.
And we've seen cases where incels specifically cite that ideology as justification for their violence.
Exactly. They see themselves as being at war with women in society that they believe has wronged them in some way.
But at the same time, a lot of these individuals also show signs of struggling with mental health issues like depression, anxiety, social isolation.
Right. So are they terrorists driven by a hateful ideology, or are they just troubled individuals lashing out from a place of pain and desperation?
Right. It feels almost impossible to separate those two things sometimes.
And that ambiguity makes it really challenging from a legal perspective.
I bet.
Some people argue that classifying incel violence as terrorism would give law enforcement more power to act, stricter legal measures and more resources dedicated to fighting the problem.
Yeah.
And it could also send a really strong message that this kind of hatred and violence won't be tolerated.
But there are definitely concerns about that approach, too.
Right, absolutely. Some people worry that labeling incels as terrorists might actually make things worse.
How so?
It could further alienate and isolate them, drive them deeper into these online echo chambers, and make them even less likely to seek help.
And it could also lead to overreach by law enforcement, potentially targeting individuals who aren't actually a threat.
It's a really delicate balancing act, and there aren't any easy answers.
It sounds like it.
But one thing's for sure, we can't just shy away from these conversations.
Right.
We need to grapple with all the complexities and try to find ways to effectively address the root causes of this violence.
So what does that look like? Where do we go from here?
Well, it means going beyond just labeling and condemning these individuals.
Okay.
We have to recognize the humanity of the people who are struggling, offer empathy and understanding, and try to create a society where everyone feels valued and connected.
So it's about addressing those underlying issues of isolation and mental health,
Yeah.
these distorted worldviews.
Exactly.
It's about challenging those harmful stereotypes and promoting healthy relationships between men and women.
It's a big task, but it's something we all have a role to play in.
Absolutely. And it's something we've been talking about throughout this whole deep dive,
Right.
exploring this really complex and often disturbing topic, challenging assumptions, and hopefully prompting some reflection and maybe even some action from our listeners.
If you've been with us this whole time, we hope this has given you a better understanding of this incel phenomenon.
The dangers it poses and the potential paths forward.
Remember, knowledge is power.
And by engaging with these difficult issues, we can all contribute to creating a safer and more compassionate world.